This is Nadia Hernandez from Wings. Thanks for joining us on this webinar that we are co-organizing with the European Foundation Center and the Global NPO Coalition on FATF. Actually, this is the third webinar that we host around FATF, and we hope to continue facilitating these spaces, considering the important role that philanthropy infrastructure actors have on this topic. As some of you might know, Wings has a seat on the Consultative FATF Forum, where our member organization, the European Foundation Center, is representing us this year and the next one. In this sense, we are glad to have this conversation as a way to encourage other organizations to be more engaged at the national level and aware of what is happening at the global level. Thanks in advance to our speakers and to all the participants. If you have any questions during the webinar, please write them in the chat box. At the end, we will have a Q&A session. And please keep in mind that this webinar is being recorded and it will be available on YouTube in the next coming days. We hope to have a fruitful conversation, and I will leave you with Hannah, who is moderating this webinar today. Thank you very much to you all.
Great. Thank you, Nadia, for the nice welcome. This is Hannah, your moderator from the European Foundation Center. Yes, it's the third webinar we are doing jointly within the Wings context. So the aim of the webinar today is to get you the latest information on FATF policy development, the NPO coalition work, and also some insights into the FATF Private Sector Consultative Forum, which happened in April this year. The key question we would like to discuss with you and get some also country-specific examples and expert know-how from some of the NPO coalition members is how can philanthropy and NPOs engage around the FATF process, both around the national risk assessments and around the FATF country evaluation process. Then we would also like to review in more detail the de-risking of NPOs. And we are also very, very delighted and happy to have Leah on board in this webinar, who will present the problem and solutions and also policy engagement to potentially solve the issue. So we only have 1 hour, so I suggest that we dive into the topic. So I will give you a very short introduction. Indeed, we have seen an increasing trend of restrictions on the operating space for the wider NPO sector, also including philanthropy globally. This is illustrated by Civicus and ICNL data, and other research organizations have also provided more data and research around this topic. This is really a worrying trend, and some of the experts have been trying to also analyze what is the motivation of governments to introduce more restrictions on our sector. And here we have, of course, a set of different motivations, and the picture is not very easy and simple. So we do have governments which are indeed concerned about civil unrest, which is potentially created by civil society organizations. Hence, they would like to control or even close down civil society. This is the case in some countries. Then we also do sense that there is a tendency to wanting to control foreign funding flows more, based on the sovereignty argument in some countries. And a third cluster of argumentation is really built around security concerns. Governments would like to fight tax crime, money laundering, and financing of terrorism. And it's really this element of the policy that we want to look at in more detail today. One of the the key international policy setter in this context is indeed the Financial Action Task Force. It's just to recall briefly, most of you in the call will already have heard about the Financial Action Task Force. It's an intergovernmental body, 36 members. It was created back in 1989, initially with the aim to counter money laundering, and then later on it was extended to the fight against the financing of terrorism as well. Now, it is an intergovernmental body. It's not really a legislature, but it is a body that issues recommendations, 40 recommendations in total, one of them specifically looking at our NPO sector. I'm stressing here that it's not really a legislator, but it is the fact that over 190 countries worldwide are implementing the FATF recommendations. So hence, it's a global standard setter. And why I would like to stress that it's a very powerful policy influencer is that FATF itself has a way of doing evaluating countries if they indeed implement the FATF policy recommendations. And the countries, they would like to score well, and hence they are doing their best to be compliant, because indeed negative scoring, non-compliance has very negative impact on the scoring of these countries. So governments tend to try their best to be compliant. As I said, it's 40 recommendations in total, and one recommendation, the recommendation 8, is particularly looking at our non-profit sector. And the old wording of the recommendation 8 singled out our sector as being particularly vulnerable for terrorism financing and encouraging governments to do whatever they can to prevent abuse of our sector. It was a broad brush of the whole sector. Now, since 2016, there is a revised wording of this article, of this recommendation 8, towards a clear risk-based approach. We, as the European Foundation Center, we are part of the global NPO coalition, which was also mentioned at the beginning, and which is co-hosting this webinar. The NPO coalition has engaged over the past years with the Financial Action Task Force, and I would now like to hand over to Kay Guillen, who is one of the co-chairs of the NPO coalition, and she will tell us a little bit more around the coalition and how it has worked over the past years. So please, the floor is yours, Kay.
Thank you very much, Hannah, and thank you to Wings for sponsoring this webinar on this important issue and for inviting us to participate. Along with Leah van Breckhoven of the Human Security Collective, I have served as co-chair of the Global NPO Coalition on FATF, which launched in 2013. You see here our mission to ensure civil societies effectively engage in debates on anti-money laundering and counter-terrorist financing, but what we are after is a free and fully enabled civil society and open operating space. The coalition has a website, fatfplatform.org. We put out a bi-monthly newsletter and conduct webinars to provide updates, information, and how-to information for the nonprofit sector. So there is an email list that you can get on if you don't receive that information already by contacting Hannah or Sanjita Goswami at the Human Security Collective. Our goal, one of our major functions as a coalition, is to coordinate nonprofit sector engagement with FATF. And now I'll turn to this next slide, a little history on what the coalition has done. In 2012, this report from Statewatch found that FATF was being used mostly in many countries as an instrument to further cut back on civil society space. And this had to do in part with problematic language in Recommendation 8 on nonprofit organizations that, as Hannah noted, at that point said nonprofits are particularly vulnerable to terrorist financing abuse, despite evidence to the contrary. So this was used either as an excuse for more repressive measures or by governments that were over-anxious to please FATF in the evaluation to over-regulate civil society. So the next slide looks at the nonprofit sector response, and I think this is speaks well of our sector's ability to affect meaningful change when we come together, work together, and engage in advocacy. In 2013, we formed the coalition, and the first ever meeting between FATF and nonprofit organizations was held in London. Over the next few years, we worked with FATF to revise guidance documents about the nonprofit sector to address much of the problematic language and the way the RA was being implemented. But we needed to change the language in the recommendation itself. And in 2016, in June, that campaign reached its final victory, I say, when FATF revised Recommendation 8 to take out that particularly vulnerable language and require a risk-based, proportionate approach to counter-terrorist financing regulation that does not unduly disrupt legitimate nonprofits. The next year, FATF admitted 4 nonprofit representatives into its private consultative forum, which is the annual meeting with non-governmental stakeholders to talk about issues affecting the FATF programs and about anti-money laundering, counter-terrorist financing regulation overall. Excuse me. Since 2016, when the recommendation changed, the coalition has been working with nonprofits in countries all around the world to implement the new recommendation at the country level, and you'll hear more about that from other speakers. Just the next slide, read at your leisure. This shows the old recommendation versus the new recommendation, and you can see how much better the new recommendation is and what an opportunity this gives us at the country level to push for rules that are proportionate and don't disrupt legitimate activities of civil society. This slide shows you the 4 basic steps of country-level action required by the new Recommendation 8. And it requires all countries to conduct a terrorist financing risk assessment, including an assessment of the nonprofit sector that identifies what risks are. And it requires outreach to the sector as part of that process. It also the next step, once risks are identified, is to review existing laws and measures, including self-regulatory programs, to see if they already address identified risks. Where gaps are found, then in step 3, risk mitigation measures should be developed that are proportionate to risk and not restrict operations. And the last step is that this can create a result that should be consistent with obligations under international human rights and humanitarian law. So this gives us 3 basic levels or pressure points for engagement with FATF at the global level, with some of its 8 regional bodies. You'll hear more. There's a great deal going on that front, and at the national level. Going forward, issues with FATF this year and for next year, FATF is still working to get countries to understand the risk-based approach and to implement it, including the changes in Recommendation 8 that require a risk assessment of the nonprofit sector. There was a meeting with coalition leadership and the FATF Secretariat at the beginning of this month, where we learned more that the national level risk assessment, many countries are still not doing it, and nonprofits are in a position to push for that to happen. It does create an opening for engagement with government on these issues that may not have existed before. The Secretariat was interested in nonprofits doing their own risk assessment, especially in countries where government is not doing it. And that is something that NPOs should look at. There may be a side event on this issue at one of the next plenaries of the FATF to help push it. They're also very interested in the de-risking issue, which we'll hear more about. But in 2019, we will need to engage with FATF on a new policy initiative where they're developing guidance on terrorist financing and risk assessment and how to do it. And this will be, their target is June 2019 for that. And so they're open to discussion with us about it, and we will engage with them on that. This year, at the Private Consultative Forum meeting in April, we engaged with FATF on some key issues. This forum brings together, as I said, representatives of many stakeholders affected by FATF recommendations. We have 4 NPO seats, and as you'll see here, that represent the coalition, technical expertise, humanitarian and philanthropic sectors. This year, we engaged with them about the de-risking issue and about how to implement the risk-based approach. In fact, we had speakers on panels about the financial access and de-risking issues. And in addition to the 4 representatives, many nonprofits were invited to a meeting where we engaged directly with banks and with FATF on the risk assessment process. So as you can see, there's a lot going on. There's a lot of potential here, and we look forward to continued engagement and with your participation and support to continue to make progress on having proportionate regulations of nonprofits that don't disrupt legitimate activities. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Kay. This was brilliant overview over the key activities of the NPO coalition, and really the NPO coalition is one of the success stories, I think, in terms of different actors and umbrella organizations and experts coming together on a topic with a very clear mandated advocacy strategy, and we were very successful also engaging and creating a more positive engagement with the Financial Action Task Force Secretariat and Presidency, and also resulting in some very concrete actions. So indeed, we understand the policy change happened in 2016, and the formalized dialogue was introduced in 2017. And this is a key window for our sector, indeed, to be able to help discussing and shaping also the FATF policy. And I wanted to flag up, as the representative for the philanthropic sector, some of the issues also that are discussed at the Private Sector Consultative Forum at the last one in April this year. In addition to the bank de-risking and the country evaluations and risk assessments that Kay mentioned, we also had some interesting conversations around the fintech and the regtech and the use of digital identity and crypto assets. And that's something where also FATF wanted to discuss with the private sector. What are the opportunities? What are the challenges around these new technical tools? And indeed, that's also where our sector could come in to think about more strategically how potentially cryptocurrency, blockchain could be used for philanthropic flows, philanthropic engagement across border. So this is something that FATF is looking at, the private sector is looking at, and that's where the conversation will continue in the future to ensure that, that the policy developed in this regard is appropriate. So Kay also raised the point that a lot more needs to be done to ensure also that our sector engages more and that country level engagement happens more by the government with the NPO sector. And I'm very pleased that Vanja Skoric from ECNL is able to give us an update on some of the work that she's been very much engaged in at the national level to ensure that the NPO sector engages more with their governments around both the risk assessment and the FATF country evaluation. So I'll now pass the floor to Vanja, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Hannah, and thank you once again for organizing this webinar. It's a really important opportunity to share the latest information, but also remind ourselves how we can engage more effectively with the FATF processes on global, regional, and as you mentioned, very importantly on national level as well. And thanks to Kay also for the excellent introduction into the standards and the coalition work. My task here is to talk a little bit more about the national level engagement and importance and potential entry points for it, and then to give you some of the resource links and tools for those of you who wish to learn more. As Kay already mentioned when she was describing the steps required to comply with Recommendation 8, the key points in complying now with the new Recommendation 8 are knowing who is at risk within the country. That also applies to the nonprofit sector. Applying a targeted, very proportionate approach, so not an approach that is the same for all, but really applying it only to those who are at risk, having conducted outreach, and we will talk about it more, and having a proportionate oversight of the sector that is, or subset of sector that is at risk. I just want to stress maybe one important point in connecting global and national level when we talk about engagement and outreach. One of the reasons our coalition on global level and on working with FATF was so successful is that we have always brought in examples from national level work. We were very practical in our approach, and we took time and effort to engage on national level and to support different organizations from different fields, from different spheres, to engage on national level, to take the lessons learned and findings back to the global level, back to the FATF, to feed in the policy changes and to ask for policy changes. And this is something very much appreciated by the FATF, and this is what gives us leverage and arguments when we work on policy changes on global level. So the global changes that and the global policy work that Kay mentioned that are ahead of us in the next year will be successful as much as we can have all of us and all of you and all of our colleagues engaging on national level and really feeding back the information, the challenges, the opportunities, the good practices, but also not so good practices or restrictive practices that we can then shape into policy arguments and concrete proposals. So moving on with the outreach, one of the key components of the new standard and the new approach that FATF is conducting towards the countries when it evaluates how the countries apply the standards is having outreach to all of those involved in their recommendations. This also means the non-profit sector. So for the country to actually score well on the standard, on the recommendation 8, it's very important that they show they did outreach. So the evaluations happen every once in, let's say, 8 to 10 years. However, this is a cycle that is ongoing, and it never stops, and I will show you how. And the FATF conducts evaluations with a team of experts, and they look into proof from the governments that they are complying with the standards, which includes proof that they are doing the outreach towards, in this case, non-profit sector. So if we move on, we can see in different examples from evaluation reports from different countries where the evaluator teams cited there was not enough outreach done to the non-profit sector. For example, there was not enough awareness raising programs, or there was no outreach or no training activities or no educational awareness raising activities conducted for the non-profit sector by the government. So the onus is on the government to actually proactively do the outreach towards the sector. This is something that many governments find new and difficult and challenging. Even if they want to do it, they seldom know how to do it properly. So the task is difficult because the FATF is actually looking for the real outreach. So they are very keen on showing whether the government is actually, doing some one-off event just before the evaluation to show that they are doing something, but they're actually not doing anything. So the outreach needs to be real. It has to be continuous. It has to really involve the non-profit sector in the dialogue with the government, and it has to be meaningful. Meaning not only, for example, having a one-way information sharing. The government produces some document and puts it on the website, and then you people can read it. No, they are really looking for a meaningful dialogue and involvement of the sector. So this is one of the wins from our side, that we insisted continuously on this engagement, turning outreach into meaningful engagement. This is what we constantly advocate for on global level, showing that it actually, on country examples increases the effectiveness of FATF standards. Because if you have a non-profit sector and the government that don't talk to each other, that are adversaries, that are in a closed, restrictive environment, then how can you expect that any measures that the government produces for protecting the sector from terrorist abuse can be effective at all? On the contrary, if there is no open engagement, open dialogue, open consultation, and willingness from the part of government to involve the sector, the less productive and effective will the measures be. So this is what we are trying to show and argue constantly with the FATF bodies and with the governments. And this is taking traction. So you can see, for example, Kay mentioned Private Sector Consultative Forum is a very important forum where we can voice our concerns and raise issues and even put forward some proposals. In 2017, the final conclusions noted the importance of involving non-profit sector in the mutual evaluation process at an early stage by the government to prepare for the evaluation, and with the focus also on effectiveness of any kind of counterterrorism measures. In 2018, we managed to get the language of engage and collaborate with NPOs during all phases, during risk assessment and during evaluation. So we are trying to evolve even FATF's thinking from, outreach, which is sometimes seen as a one-sided action from the government to the sector. We are evolving slowly to engagement and collaboration, which is a two-way process, and the dialogue. We can go on. So how to do it? There are a couple of phases, very simplified breakdown of phases of the evaluation process, before, during, and after. So I'll just briefly explain what happens in each phase, and then we can go to some entry points of how to do the engagement on the ground. So before the evaluation, of course, the country and the evaluators teams from the FATF or FATF regional body are preparing for the evaluation. Different materials are being shared, and there are checks of existing legislation and regulations from the country on various topics, including the recommendation 8, so including the non-profit sector. And this is a phase that lasts for a couple of months, at least 6 months. Now, during the evaluation itself, the evaluators team comes into the country for 2 weeks and meets government bodies, government institutions, and different private sector and non-profit sector actors. Usually, non-profits get 1 hour or 2 hour meeting within these 2 weeks, because our recommendation 8 is only one of the 40 recommendations being evaluated. So they discuss with the non-profit representatives their opinions about, the whole system, the regulatory environment, and what is the perception of non-profit organizations about the risks of terrorist financing. After the evaluation visit is done, they are preparing a report, a mutual evaluation report. So when you see this MER, this is the report that is being published, and it's always public, this report, usually 6 to 10 months after the evaluation visit. In this report, there are also recommendations what country needs to do next to comply with the standards. So then when you look at the recommendation 8 section, it will usually say something that the country needs to improve in terms of dealing with the non-profit sector and its risk. And here we often see the additional recommendation to improve the outreach. So when you look for you can look it up, you can Google your country, FATF evaluation report, and then the name of the country you're interested in. And then if you look up the recommendation 8 section, and in the end you can see some of the findings and conclusions and recommendations, there is likely to be something said about outreach that needs to improve. So the follow-up phase is also very important because then the country needs to again prove every year or every 2 years to the FATF or regional FATF body that it is working on implementing the recommendations and addressing the shortcomings from the report. So if the report includes a lot of shortcomings about non-profit sector, it is expected that the government will have a flurry of activities, unfortunately usually on the regulatory side, trying to comply with the FATF standard and trying to score better on the recommendation 8. So it's important for the sector to be engaged in this after evaluation process as well, to monitor what the government is doing with it. And if you're wondering who the evaluators are, they are usually coming from peer countries. So the evaluations are set as a peer review. Commonly, they're coming from financial institutions, financial intelligence, justice departments of Ministry of Justice, police, or similar background. They should pass a training on all recommendations, on all standards. But as you can imagine, non-profit sector is not high on the priority list for education or in general for evaluators. They usually deal more with, this, let's say, quote unquote, serious issues. And then the non-profit sector education drops somewhere, behind the lines, and it's not considered very, very important. Unfortunately, that has consequences for us later on. So what are the entry points in this whole cycle of evaluations? Before the evaluation even starts, the countries are due to conduct national risk assessments that might include specific risk assessment for non-profit sector. It is advisable and it's a standard requirement to include non-profit sector into this assessment. It is also advisable for non-profit sector to ask proactively to be included in it. Why? Because this assessment will determine which types of organizations government finds at most risk. And usually those who have a high turnover of funds coming in or going out will be looked at with more scrutiny, or those who have activities in areas or communities considered at high risk. So it's really important to ask and require to be engaged in this type of activity. Then, of course, it's important to understand which measures government wants to propose to mitigate the risks that they found in the risk assessment. And this is also where our sector can actually contribute the most, because measures don't mean only laws and regulations. It is very clear in the FATF standard that measures can be anything, including soft measures like awareness raising, education of the sector, self-regulatory mechanisms that our sector sometimes has, like codes of conduct or different other mechanisms, internal mechanisms for different, especially large organizations that have a very developed and sophisticated internal monitoring and compliance systems. So all of these can be listed as measures that the sector is actually doing themselves to mitigate the risks from any potential abuse of their finances, including potential terrorist financing abuse. During the meeting with evaluators, as far as we have heard and know from experience, the non-profit sector representatives are asked about their perceptions and thoughts about their own risk. So it's really important for non-profit organizations to think about it and consider, where they are in this bigger scheme of risk of being abused, and discuss it with evaluators. They can also discuss how they see their regulatory environment in their country, whether they see it as effective or not effective. So if it's too restrictive, then we argue usually it's not effective because it constrains civil society activities and non-profit activities, which is counterproductive for combating terrorism and terrorism financing in general. So we kind of turn this conversation from having rights and freedoms into being effective or not effective, because evaluators from FATF don't really have the mandate to discuss rights and freedoms, although they have to keep it in mind, but they do have very high interest into whether we think and can show that measures taken by the government, meaning some laws or regulations, are effective or not effective for combating terrorism financing. And then in the third phase of the follow-up, after the evaluations is done, it's important to follow when the report is published, what it says about non-profit sector, what are the recommendations and findings for the government, and what the government will take on board, and how they will try to follow it up. And this is also an entry point for our sector to engage with the government and discuss how to do new measures that are maybe required by the FATF report. So you see, this is an ongoing process, so it never ends, really. You can check this slide afterwards in more detail. And there are, along the way, within the cycle, numerous challenges, of course. The evaluations don't usually include a specialist or expert on civil society. So basically, you're talking to people who don't have experience with how non-profit sector operates. There is often lack of government outreach and genuine engagement with the sector in this entire process. And in some cases, a misapplication and even on purpose, application of the measures that conduce the shrinking of the space for our operations, which we then argue is counterproductive for mitigating terrorist abuse and terrorist threats. So strategy options, in short, the best one is to try to engage with authorities, with the governments, from the risk assessment to evaluation to follow-up. Really requires a wider coalition and wider diversity of the actors, because everybody is impacted. Usually very successfully if main umbrella organizations are on board. And basically the idea is to try to have an open dialogue with the government about the concerns and try to show them that you can offer actually some of the solutions, some of the options, and show that the sector is actually doing a lot already on, being accountable, transparent by our own account or by existing self-regulatory mechanisms and our internal regulations. If the government is not very open to collaborate, there have been examples, and there are some pilots going on conducting our own assessment of the risk within the non-profit sector, basically trying to document existing self-regulation or existing regulation mechanisms that help us mitigate any terrorism risk, considering where are the weaknesses and what could potentially be done, and then offering those to the government as an argument against additional restrictions and additional regulation. This requires experts on board, so but there is an example of Swiss NPO sector trying to do it on their own as well. And then, of course, continuously being vigilant to push back on the restrictions that are coming from the counterterrorism sphere, especially those that are not based on conducted risk assessment, that are not targeted, that are not proportionate, so that are not in line with the FATF standard. So really making a case that FATF requires effective, targeted, proportional approach based on the risk that is identified, and if this is not present, then you can't have a regulation saying, oh, we are trying to combat terrorism financing with it, but where's the evidence that you identify the risk, that this is a targeted approach, and so on. So this is very important strategy. You can use different tools and resources that we've developed over the years. There is a briefer paper, How Can Civil Society Effectively Engage, where all of these phases and strategy options are elaborated in more detail. You see the link here. Then we also drafted from one of our trainings for CSO colleagues, a country engagement strategy. You can see the link here and download and use it, adapt it to your needs and use it as you see fit. It's like a short questionnaire document that can lead you through what you need to know and what you need to find out if you want to engage with your government within your country in these processes. And then there's a toolkit developed by our colleagues from ICNL on main issues and strategic options and timelines for engaging. There's a link there. It's currently in Spanish, but it's being translated in English, so it will soon be available in English as well. So I hope this can help you think through some of the country level strategies. And of course, we are here always to answer any additional questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Vanya. That was a very rich overview in terms of the different entry points that are there for the NPO and the philanthropic sector. And I'm sure if there are follow-up questions, we can also, deal with it a little bit later. We do not have a lot of time for discussion in this webinar, but I would just like to illustrate a little bit kind of what you've just said with some case studies of how actually the FATF evaluation has led to kind of more global coalition building of different actors, part of the NPO sector in different countries. So indeed, this is somehow the crucial point that the NPO sector gets better united around the issue. In many countries, the NPO sector is quite fragmented. There are lots of different actors, different umbrella organizations. So it is very important that the sector gets its act together to come together and to discuss also across the different legal forms that they may have and the different umbrella organizations that there are. Now, we will have a short update here on the evaluation of Germany. Germany is ahead of the next round of mutual evaluations. So right now, it's the pre-process. So Germany is also organizing itself right now in terms of bringing different NPO players together. The national risk assessment is happening, has started already, and the on-site visit of the FATF evaluator is expected in 2020. So Germany, the NPO sector still has a bit of time to engage, and they have started already. Here, Mecenata Foundation in particular has played a role in organizing awareness-raising events around the issue of FATF, and also bringing different actors from the nonprofit sector together. There were already some initial conversations also with the Ministry of Finance, which is the lead authority, the lead ministry on this file in Germany. And Rupert Strachbit, who unfortunately cannot be on this call, wanted me to highlight two things really as lessons or important lessons to learn. That is that it's very important to make the contact with the government in case the government does not reach out to you. It is also very important for the NPO sector to be proactive, so as to be able to do some preparatory work, prepare the documents, and that was the second point, that indeed the NPO sector absolutely should take the FATF evaluation seriously and should already see to engage also in the risk assessment when the government is reviewing which part of the NPO sector are potentially at risk for terrorism financing. This is a very important moment also to exchange views with the government to make sure that already existing also soft law approaches are taken into account when measuring the risk. So this is indeed a country that is ahead of the evaluation, where we sense that already the sector is mobilizing, is creating some kind of hub to mobilize the NPO sector to do the engagement also proactively with the government. Then I would also like to briefly touch upon the Czech evaluation. So the Czech evaluation is ongoing. And the Czech Donors Forum heard about the FATF evaluation through the Government Council of NGOs, and again the Ministry of Finance being the lead part of the government on this file. How did they prepare? Indeed, this was part of also NPO coalition work and some related projects to it, where national level work was very important. So we helped them organize an event where different NPO players were brought together and where we shared some lessons learned of country evaluations in other countries and tried to give them also some guidance of how they can prepare themselves for the on-site visit and for the conversations with the government. The on-site visit then happened in the spring this year. and the FATF evaluators talked to 3 NPOs, including the Czech Donors Forum. I mean, if you are interested in more details, then you can of course contact the Czech Donors Forum for more information. Clearly, what they stated in terms of the lessons learned is that they would argue for a more transparent process around the FATF evaluations, because they were not able to access really a lot of information beforehand. Also, then there was no possibility to comment on the report. And as Vanya also said, the on-site visit itself is very short, only a couple of hours, and it's not really clear how well the points and arguments were taken into account. So this is there was a strong call for more transparency on the process. Then I could maybe just briefly highlight also that in Belgium, right now, the European Foundation Center and also the Belgian network, we've been engaged with the evaluation in Belgium, and we are in the post-evaluation process. So this is really the third group where it's also very important to engage, because Belgium had to do some homework in kind of tightening some of the rules and some of the control mechanisms, and we are right now facing the fact that the FATF policy and had some serious influence also on our government, because we've seen recent law revisions in the pipeline, which are indeed seeking to reduce some of the risks related to our sector. So this is really important to take the FATF serious, to take the policy serious, but also to ensure you do your own assessment of the risk and analyze very well as a sector how the risk can potentially be addressed. So this, in a way, in a nutshell, gives you a bit of an illustration of how the different philanthropic organizations have already engaged in this FATF evaluation process, and there is a call on you to make sure you reach out to your government in case your government does not reach out to you. You can download on the FATF website the time frame of when your country is assessed, so please go and check it and ensure that you engage around the process. Vanya also highlighted some of the useful toolkits or tools that you can use to inform yourself better and to prepare yourself better. So please, we are all at your disposal for further information on this. Now, one of the consequences or the unintended consequences that we have been facing based on the FATF policy has been that the banking sector has become much more risk averse. And I'm very, very happy that we have Leah van Broekhoven here with us in the webinar from Human Security Collective. She's also co-chair of the Global NPO Coalition, and she will give us a bit of an update of the latest developments around the de-risking, what is the state of play, the problem, but also what are potential solutions, and how does the NPO sector, how do the NPOs engage around this? So Leah, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Hannah, and thank you also to Wings for organizing this webinar. Also, thank you to my colleagues for the very insightful presentations on FATF and how their standards impact nonprofit organizations across the world. I will share with you, as Hannah said, what is de-risking of nonprofit organizations and how this relates to the FATF anti-money laundering and countering terrorism financing rules. First, de-risking. A number of you may know what it is, but just to clarify it, de-risking is a decision by a financial institution to refuse the opening of a bank account, to delay the transaction from the sender to the receiver, and to close the account of a customer. Why are banks de-risking? Banks are de-risking because international rules and regulations stemming from the Financial Action Task Force, their anti-money laundering and countering terrorism financing rules, but also UN Security Council sanctions and US designated terrorist lists, banks have to apply those. Banks are considered by the FATF to be gatekeepers for the prevention of money laundering and terrorism financing, disrupting the integrity of the international financial system. They are also obliged to provide financial intelligence data to authorities in the countries, an important body to which banks are obliged to submit suspect financial reports our financial actions is the Financial Intelligence Unit, which very closely works with the FATF. Now, there is, in the past years, there have been several reports that show that de-risking is not anecdotal anymore. There is enough evidence that de-risking is a trend. I will highlight a number of reports which you can all find on the FATF platform. First report that came out was conducted by the Global Center for Cooperative Security in Oxfam, USA in 2015. The effects of de-risking on the financial inclusion of NPOs. The key conclusion of this report was that to solve the problem of de-risking, all relevant stakeholders, governments, banks, non-profit organizations, government regulators and supervisors like the central bank need to come together and find solutions together. The Charity and Security Network, and you heard Katie Nain speaking, she's the director of the network, came out with a very important report that put de-risking high of the agenda in the U.S., Financial Access for U.S. Nonprofits in 2017. That report showed that almost 70% of the NPOs experience regular problems with their banks, either in transmitting money or in opening bank accounts, or in providing extra information to banks or to the correspondent banks. That is the banks, the correspondent bank is the intermediate banks between the sending bank and the receiving bank. The UK-based Charity Finance Group report of 2018 showed that 80% of the UK charities face some kind of difficulty in accessing or using mainstream banking channels. The key conclusion of that report was that most of these charities started using other means to get money from A to B. And some of these means are using money mules that are not very much trusted and increase the risk of the money falling into the wrong hands, or using more, I would say, mundane means like carrying cash in suitcases to countries that banks don't want to send money to via NPOs any longer, like Syria or Yemen. A study by Chatham House showed that the de-risking decision by banks had a relation with the fact that banks were interpreting the FATF recommendation 8 as that all NPOs are particularly vulnerable for terrorism financing. That was still the case in 2017, although my colleagues have said that the FATF already changed that recommendation in 2016, but they're still using the old recommendation that NPOs are particularly vulnerable for terrorism financing, leading to wholesale de-risking of the NPO sector in the UK. Recent studies conducted by the Humanitarian Forum, the Overseas Development Institute, and the London School of Economics in 2018 show that de-risking is a problem, particularly for countries where humanitarian needs are the highest at the moment. The majority of the humanitarian organizations that were interviewed for this study, majority are from the UK, use again other means, other channels to get the money to their beneficiaries, to the recipients. And this means that they are not any longer having an audit trail that they should have to be accountable and transparent on their money transfers. Human Security Collective and European Centre for Not-for-Profit Law conducted a study on de-risking called At the Intersection of Security and Regulations, Understanding the Drivers of De-risking and Impact on Non-Profits, that came out last year. And one of the conclusions of this study is that de-risking is not only problematic for money flows going to countries that are under sanctions rules or are so-called high-risk jurisdictions, as determined also by the FATF. But de-risking is also a phenomenon that happens in countries like Brazil or Mexico, where there are problems with internal transfers. And banks we have interviewed for this study said that they associate more and more nonprofits in these two specific countries in Latin America with money laundering and corruption. And based on that, they tend to de-risk the NPOs. The key takeaways of these studies, and there are a number more that have been have appeared in the past years, but the key takeaways are there is de-risking, and it's taking place on a massive scale worldwide. Smaller NPOs are more impacted than larger ones, having less capacity to cope with banks' extended due diligence requirements. It's impacting NPO programs, and it's impacting the cost of the programs because of the questions asked by banks to NPOs to show that they are not running too much risk to become a client of the bank or transfer the money. The banks are coming back to the NPOs with more and more questions. So proportionate more questions than NPOs think is justifiable for the activities they are carrying out. De-risking is forcing NPOs to move money in less transparent and accountable ways, including carrying cash or using money mules. NPOs themselves are looking for short-term quick fixes and not systemic solutions. NPOs are bearing the residual risk of the securitization and regulation agenda of policy of donors that have to comply with the FATF, AML, and CFT rules. De-risking is specifically impacting local and community organizations, those at the end of the chain and at the end of the receiving the money from NPOs, intermediate NPOs, or back donors. And these local and community organizations are most pivotal, are most important for a lot of activities in which we all involved, varying from human rights to development to humanitarian assistance. The key takeaways, and one more thing, donors are important stakeholders, but only recently donors have stepped up their efforts to lead on finding solutions for de-risking, because it's also affecting their program, since their countries cannot any longer implement programs in high-risk jurisdictions or conflict areas in particular. Okay, so the key takeaways, if we just get them together, bundle them together, is that de-risking of NPOs affect the rollout of sustainable development goals and humanitarian assistance. It affects the financial inclusion agenda because a growing number of non-profit organizations and civil societies are pushed out of the formal banking sector. Civic space in general, which is already impacted worldwide, is being hampered by de-risking. And if you look to de-risking from the lens of the prevention of violent extremism agenda, de-risking has a counterproductive effect, an adverse effect, because the small grassroots organizations, which are crucial in preventing violent extremism in high-risk areas and conflict areas, cannot any longer be served or supported with money or with other means to do their activities. So our global coalition has started to raise awareness with the FATF and with about de-risking and what is happening with NPOs. We do that through our presence at the Private Sector Consultative Forum, which is already set by the previous speakers. We also build capacities on countering terrorism financing for both NPOs and government, where we also include the practice of de-risking, which is a consequence of the interpretation of these money laundering and terrorism financing rules and regulations by the FATF. The NPO Expert Hub, which we set up, is very pivotal in providing this capacity. And what we've noticed is that we, as a group that have joined the Global Coalition and set up the Expert Hub, are more cognizant about the FATF rules and regulations, how they impact us. The governments are lagging behind, as Vanya also said, in terms of understanding the risk-based approach to an effective AML and CFT implementation. So there's also need to capacitate governments on this. With regard to the de-risking agenda, in particular, I want to highlight the World Bank ACAMS work streams. These are work streams set up by an initiative which the World Bank facilitates and which is particularly focused on de-risking in America, but is also articulated with similar initiatives in the UK and in the Netherlands, where all relevant stakeholders together are coming together to identify solutions. One of the current activities of the World Bank ACAMS initiative in the US is that governments, NPOs, and banks are assembling and collating risk management practices within each of their sectors. And that will then be produced in a reference material guidebook for all the stakeholders, but also for the supervisors, so they know what risk mitigation and risk management practices are already in existence, including self-regulation measures within the NPO sector to prevent corruption, money laundering, and terrorism financing. Then, next slide, because we've already mentioned the engagement with the Financial Action Task Force on de-risking. I think I would like to close with highlighting an initiative which a number of the global coalition members are are involved with at the moment. What we would like to organize is at a G20 summit, which takes place in Buenos Aires at the end of November, a side event to place the issue of de-risking on their agenda, on their radar. With this side event, they would like to call upon the G20 to ensure closer coordination between all government stakeholders on international aid, counterterrorism, and terrorism financing to guard against unintentional conflicting policy outcomes, which are now happening. We would also like to call upon the G20 to mandate the global, can we go back to the slide? To mandate the Global Partnership for Financial Inclusion to set up a working group on nonprofits and de-risking, and to task the Financial Action Task Force for specific guidance on NPOs and de-risking. Next slide, please. Thank you. Specific recommendations for the FATF by the G20, which we will raise in our side event in Buenos Aires, is that FATF produce specific guidance for NPOs on compliance requirements, task regulators with providing NPO-specific guidance to banks, ensure that bank supervisors as well as bank guidance and practices implement the changed FATF Recommendation 8 and the risk-based approach, explore technological solutions which could help lower the cost of compliance, and explore safe payment alternatives through correspondent banking, including through central development banks or dedicated charity banks. And when we move on, we have specific recommendations for the G20 itself. We would like the G20 to set up a subgroup akin to the one on small and medium enterprises to develop specific action items regarding nonprofits under the Action Plan on Financial Inclusion, which is a mouthful, but you can all read this on our FATF platform website. We want to have a review of existing evidence of the negative impact of de-risking on NPOs, financial transfer, and the broader operating environment for NPOs. And we want to have a proposed global guidance or principles to ensure NPO access to financial services and inclusion of an indicator on monitoring NPO access to the financial system in the G20 financial inclusion activities. So yes, this is, we hope that when you are listening, that you would also be able to disseminate our G20 ask, which are available on our website, to any relevant stakeholder you deem important that should know about our upcoming site event in Buenos Aires. Thank you, and questions are welcome.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Leah. That was excellent, very dense, and you managed very well to provide a very, very kind of important overview of how the NPO coalition actors are already engaging around the bank de-risking. And indeed, I understand that it's really a call also for philanthropic infrastructure organizations to engage around the G20 initiative, in particular where there are G20 countries and infrastructure organizations that have good links with their governments, that this is an invitation for them to approach them also with the letter that was drafted by NPO actors. So the letter is, so we can circulate it maybe also after this webinar to make sure that everybody has it, so that this can be plugged into the G20 event. So for me, it's now just the kind of the role to quickly sum up the very rich presentations that were presented and how to link it up to how you can potentially, as philanthropic infrastructure organizations, engage. Of course, you can join the NPO coalition. There's a lot of material on the website. It was referred to, a lot of tools available there as well. Then, of course, you can also use those NPOs that have a seat on the Private Sector Consultative Forum, to use them, to use also me as European Foundation Center Wings representative for the philanthropic sector. If you have specific issues that you would like to bring up, contact us so that we can potentially plug it into the formal process. Then let us know in case there are cases happening at the national level, over-regulation happening, so that we can help. You can also help monitor the developments. Then for sure, we stated that it is important that the NPO sector liaises better within a country, create bridges within your own sectors, and use existing toolkits to prepare around the risk assessment and to engage around the FATF evaluation process. So these, in a nutshell, are the summary points from this webinar. There were some questions raised by participants. So one of the more recent question about the G20, how do we engage around the G20 specifically, by Chris Warman. Leah, is that something you would like to answer? Otherwise, I would say that around the G20, there is this letter prepared with a key ask that you can then take and use for your engagement with your government, specifically to raise the asks that are formulated in the letter that Leah just presented.
Yes, and happy also to send Chris the letter. And then I think that's important, Chris. And I also saw you're linking on LinkedIn, so happy to connect with you and to give you more details. But indeed, you know, approach your own government. And I don't know where you are, Chris, if you're in the USA, Kegine is also engaging or trying to engage with Treasury on the G20 ask. So there is a natural link there as well. Thank you.
Then there was also a question by Emma about, during Vanya's presentation, around indeed the kind of the outreach and the engagement, that this is an important factor in the FATF evaluation process. And she was asking whether the quality of the outreach and the engagement, whether that is measured or whether that's more like a box ticking exercise. Vanya, would you like to take that question? Okay. Otherwise, I think that I will go ahead and answer it. I think it's not really a box ticking exercise. I mean, so far, I think in the country reports, it was for sure called very negatively if no outreach has happened. And as Vanya outlined, indeed, it is also that FATF itself is promoting kind of a quality outreach and engagement by the government. So this is really moving more into the direction of not just looking at a formal, that yes, box ticking exercise, it is more looking at really outreach and engagement around this. Then there was one more question about a repository, and I think the question was sent to Kay. So Kay, I don't know if you would quickly like to answer the question around the repository.
I'd be happy to talk about that. Thank you. As part of the World Bank ACAM's multi-stakeholder dialogue, there is a work stream established to look at the ways technology can contribute to solutions for nonprofit banking problems. And one of the ways we have identified is through we'd like to create a repository of information on NPOs that banks could access to get the due diligence information that they need to provide services. Right now, the whole system of bank collecting information on nonprofits is disorganized, it's inefficient, it doesn't work well for anyone, and there are a lot of unnecessary information requests that come out of it. So NGO Source, which those of you in philanthropy may well be familiar with, and it's something that TechSoup Global has built and has been serving U.S. grant makers as a repository of information on foreign nonprofits that they can give grants to. And so the technology exists, and we are working with TechSoup Global on a needs assessment and concept note to look at how this can be adapted into the banking context. So people who are interested in that, please do contact me or Chris Warman at TechSoup Global.
Okay, great, Kate. So I think we ran a little bit over time, but we started a little bit late, so I hope that everybody bear with us. So I would like to then close from our side the event. Thanks again to all the speakers for their great presentations. And I hand over to Nadia maybe to do a closing remark. And if there are any open questions, do not hesitate to contact us by email so that we can connect you to also the speakers to review in more detail the issues you would like to discuss. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hannah, and thank you very much to you all that were with us during this webinar. We will send you the information about the letter, the PowerPoint presentation, and the link so you can circulate with your colleagues that were not able to join us today. Thank you very much to you all, and hope to continue in this conversation in the future.